Can you? Right.
Great.
And here we go. All right. Yeah. I'm obviously not Peter. I'm Sandra. I'm one of the co-founders of medievals.net and a lifelong friend of Peter Konieczny. Peter, hi, he's watching. And welcome to this talk on Crusader Criminals. A bit about Steve Tibble. Steve is a research associate at Royal Holloway College who specializes in the Crusades and the Knights Templar. In his spare time, he enjoys battling pub boars and debunking Templar myths. He has quite a few books under his belt: Monarchy and Lordships in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, 1099 to 1291, from 1989. Then The Crusader Armies, 2018. Crusader Strategy Defending the Holy Land, 2020. The Templars, which he released last summer. And this summer, his latest Criminal Crusaders, hot off the press. So I'm going to start off naturally with my first question. What made you want to write this hot on the heels of the Templars?
Wow, yes, thank you. The thing I really love about the Crusades, and I suspect it's true for a lot of us, is that they're so different. You know, they led such different lives. And I lead a very comfortable life, you know, a safe life. And so I just have a huge amount of respect for people who do crazy things. Even though, you know, you might not want to go on holiday with them, but you kind of have to respect the fact that they did get up in the morning and do things. They had almost no resources, and they really changed their own world, and they did extraordinary things. One thing I noticed when I was doing, effectively the Templars were the end of a trilogy, which Yale, who are wonderful publishers, and I have to say that because they're in the room, and no, but they really are. They're a real treat to work with. Basically, the Templars was the end of a trilogy on basically the Crusaders at war. So you get to read a lot of, you know, all the different chronicles, all the different materials, and there's lots of big events in all of those, which is, you know, as historians, we tend to follow the big events, and that's natural, and that's where the evidence is. But I noticed whenever you come across a big event, for every big event, there's a couple of minor details, you know, and you struggle to know what to do with them. You don't know where they fit. They haven't really been told because they don't fit anywhere. But there was such a mass of criminality going on as well. So it got me thinking, okay, we've, you know, all the narrative-driven stuff has kind of been done to death. Obviously, we've all got lots more to do because we love it. But, you know, I felt there were a lot of smaller stories to be told around criminality. And I also tried to look at the bigger picture, to look at the bigger trends, to see what might be causing this criminality. And that way you can bring a series of seemingly random stories in not only to life, hopefully, but you can put them within a framework of causality. Mm-hmm. So I had just great fun doing it, looking at the bigger picture, what's causing all this chaos, and then seeing how that chaos rolled out. You know, it's effectively like reading, first of all, reading The Economist and getting the big picture, and then you're down into Daily Mail and, you know, he killed him, and so on. And joining those two was great fun for me, because as a historian, you normally do the, you know, the kind of horizontal cut, weddings, battles, you know, that kind of stuff. But to go from the really big causal things like climate change, migration, and what have you, which hopefully we'll talk about soon, and linking that to social chaos and how people lived on the ground. It was a privilege actually to be able to give a voice to some of these stories that haven't been told.
That's actually a good segue into my second question. So, so one of the most interesting things for me that you mentioned in the book is that climate had an influence on the uptick of violence. So you said here, from 300 to 900, there were only 11 years of drought, and then from 950 to 1072, they had a drought every 4 to 5 years. So can you tell us a little bit about like how that impacted crusading and the rising levels of violence?
Absolutely. I mean, the failure of the Nile, as you pointed out there, was a big factor. This is, and I'm sure all of you are aware of Ronnie Ellenblum and the work he did. He very sadly, taken from us very unexpectedly. But he was doing fantastic work on climate change and the impact that had on the Crusades, and that really changed the way I looked at everything. And the obvious way of looking at it, which Ronnie was looking at in great detail, and hopefully we'll get more from him as his executors produce his last works, is how that impacted on migration and the Turkic invasions of the 11th century and so on, and that kind of ripple effect to a large extent caused a lot of the Crusades, which is all very true, and a lot of good work still needs to be done on that. But I kind of got to thinking, well, it's not just armies that affects, it's also society. It's how people live on the ground. And the effect of a crusade and a jihad and every army in the region kind of beefing itself up created a kind of a demographic vortex, which as a military historian you take for granted. These guys all had big armies. What do you need for a big medieval army? Well, you need lots of warm bodies. And so you suck in warm bodies from everywhere, really. I mean, you've got the Atlantic coast, you've got guys from Ireland coming in, you've got sub-Saharan guys fighting in the Fatimid armies, you've got Turkic soldiers and later Mongols coming from as far afield as China. It's just huge. And then you look at a map of the Holy Land, and crikey, you can barely see it. In fact, my wife, just as an experiment, did a Google map two Google maps. The first one was the Crusades of fighting in the Holy Land, which looks big when you see it. You look at the battles and you think, wow, Hattin, Montgisard, yes, this Crac de Chevalier, they're all here and they're big names. Then you look at the Google Earth map, which shows the extent of the scale of the vortex, and you can barely see it. It's just this tiny little rim on the Eastern Mediterranean. So you have such a bizarre concentration of people and a particular kind of person coming into this area caused by the Crusades. So to me, the theme of the book, and the thing I enjoyed most, was saying, okay, this is what happens when wars take place, particularly crazy wars that just bring in people from all over the world and don't end. You have 200 years without a proper ending to the fighting. But what does it do to societies? Because you have all of these mainly young men sucked into the area. They're disinhibited, they're away from their families, they're armed. They do all the bad, crazy things that kind of demographic does. And there was the thing that clarified it for me was partly Ronnie Ellenblum's work, and which is fantastic, but it was also Casablanca, which is one of my favorite films. And I'm sure you all remember at the end, there's this kind of sarcastic line where the captain, Louis Renault, says, we'll round up the usual suspects, which is kind of a joke, obviously, but it's so true. And it has huge resonance for the Crusades. And there's two parts to that sentence. There's the rounding up and there's the usual suspects. So I put a lot of effort into looking at the demographics. So the usual suspects of criminality now and in the Middle Ages are, the young men, the drifters, people who are away from their families. And here, they're actually armed as well and trained. And for large periods of time, they're unemployed or underemployed. So you've got this cocktail of the world's most lethal demographic. The other part of the sentence is the rounding up. And normally, lazy policemen round up the usual suspects. That's the trope. But in the Crusades, they didn't. They rounded themselves up. You had this. They are just sucked in to this relatively small region. So to me, it's a criminal explosion. Right. And it sounds kind of tabloid to have Crusader criminals, but it's actually it is a bit tabloid, but it's a reflection of something that's much broader, and it's a big anthropological story that still needs to be told, I think.
I know you've been over this material for many, many, many years, but did you come across anything that really surprised you this time around when you were looking at the criminality, or were you like,
Yeah. I think that the surprising thing I found sometimes was looking at stories that I thought I knew, and then looking at it through the prism of anthropology and criminology, and seeing how you can interpret the whole thing so differently. There's one, so for instance, there's 100 for instances in there. But for instance, if we think about Zeni, very, very prominent warlord in the 12th century, and he came from a very violent upbringing, but the manner of his death looks very normal in a kind of crusadery sense. It's very violent, but as you think, oh well, okay, well that's what happens. But actually, what happened to him was he used to collect young boys, and particularly young boys from his enemies. So that he called them his stallions, and he would mutilate them, so they would be castrated and what have you, and they would be his companions at night. So they would be mutilated slaves. And one night he got very, very drunk. He was a very heavy drinker, and I think all of the guys got drunk. And he made the mistake of waking up halfway through the night and saw his mutilated slaves finishing off the booze, basically, like kids at a party. They got the best wine and they were going to finish it. So he told them they were going to get killed the following day, which is a big mistake. But do it if you have to, but don't tell them you're going to do it when they outnumber you 10-1. So we have a mini slave revolt, and one guy kills him, presumably one of his lovers. So there's this whole other dynamic going on, and emotions are so high that he gets decapitated. So Zeni who had a very, very crazy, violent upbringing, and I think his father probably killed his mother with a knife as a joke, but he wasn't quite sure who his mother was. So so that you can see there's a lot of learned behavior here. So that's the classic story, and it's true as far as we know. But the weird thing is, if you look at it through the prism of the usual suspects, everybody in that room was a foreigner. As far as we know, there wasn't a single Arab in the room. So Zeni was Turkic. I think he was late 40s, early 50s. So he was an older man there. Everybody else in the room was foreign, was young, was dislocated from their families. It's the classic demographic of people who are equipped for violence and able to do it at some point. So I found continually, you look at what you think are the classic stories, but you put a slightly different twist on it, and that gives you a whole new perspective.
So my next question is, if you can talk a bit about the two codes. So you mentioned codes that were meant to be a force for good.
Yes.
The Christian concept of chivalry, and then you have the Muslim concept of Crusader, and why they failed at reining in the violence.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Yeah. I don't know about you, and I sort of hope that chivalry and the cultural equivalents would have had an impact on subduing or at least restraining people's behavior. That sort of, as you think, would be the part of the point. And both sides. So obviously, the Islamic side had Crusader, which is not 100% equivalent, but it's a code of conduct that has many things in common. And then you have the gradual growth of a chivalrous culture on the European side. But it's hugely disappointing. Particularly if you look, say, at chivalry, it kind of applies to posh women who you're trying to impress. It's kind of it's a very select group. It's a select group of men applying it to their behavior in the context of a select group of women. And like the Knights of the Round Table reaffirmed their vows every year not to rape women, particularly genteel women. Which you think, okay, well, is that good? Yes, not raping gentle women is a good thing. But two other key points: A, what kind of society needs men to say they're not going to rape people every year? That's kind of kind of a bad thing. You shouldn't need to do that. And the other thing is the gentlewomen bit. So that's 1% of the female population. So what do you do with the other 99%? And how much of a restraint is it? And you find very much the same on the Muslim side. If you read people like Usama and his fabulous stories, and they're very, these are domestic stories that he's actually proud of, and you can see his family doing the same thing. Usama actually murdered an unarmed man when he was, I think, 12,
10
maybe 10 or 12.
10.
Yeah. And he was so proud of this, he wrote about it. And this servant was unarmed, unsuspecting, and he'd irritated him by chasing one of the other servants around. And then he tells another story, again, of in an approving way, of how his father almost killed one of his servants. The servant was late coming up with some armor. So Usama's dad cut his arm off with a sword. And Usama put this story out in a very positive light because his dad gave a pension to the poor guy's family. He was unemployable after this. I mean, if he was slow coming up with the armor with two arms, he was going to be even slower with one. So, so you can see that. But his behavior was being seen as chivalrous because he was looking after a widow, or not a widow, but looking after somebody who had an unemployed husband now. Though in fact, to our eyes, it's not exactly Downton Abbey. These are servants being absolutely brutalized, and that worked on all sides. Yeah, no, deeply disappointing.
And the other thing too, like another deeply, I guess, disappointing thing is, you mentioned a lot of the gruesome kind of methods used to punish crime, and those weren't a deterrent. Like, and there's one point in the book where you talk about a man being nailed or crucified to a camel. And
it's a camel you have to worry about, isn't it?
I'm trying to still trying to wrap my head around that one. And someone being nailed to a gate, and also the fact that there was so much violence, and you wrote something where they weren't satiated by it. So what, with the punishments and the violence, you would think at some point they would have enough, but can you tell us why that was not the case?
Yes. Well, there's a lot of very good points in there. I think satiety, or being satiated with blood is a big one. And I came with a hope to this, that thinking that people who've been fighting and have seen bloodshed come home and get slightly satiated by it. And I kind of had an idealized view of England after the Second World War, with soldiers coming home, and actually crime levels were not high after they came home because people had enough of war. I think if that was true, that was an aberration, because that's sort of the opposite of what you find in the Crusades. You find people get desensitized, so there's no satiation. It's guys get used to killing becomes easier. I think once probably Hannibal Lecter said this, but your first murder is the difficult one. It only gets easier. And I think that's what you find with all these armed and dangerous young men that are just swamping the area.
And with the punishments being so gruesome, like the camel thing and whatnot, that didn't deter anybody. I mean,
again, that's, you would think. And again, I think that has implications for modern justice. That to an extent, if you had, say, capital punishment, how does that? You'd think, okay, well, I know that if I do this bad thing, I'm going to get killed. So I wouldn't do it. But in reality, a lot of the kinds of people who are doing these things are so hormonal or drunk or drugged or whatever that they're not going through it rationally. I mean, if you were thinking rationally, you probably wouldn't have done it in the first place.
True.
So you don't have that rational connection with cause and effect. And, if I do this, X will happen to me. And I think certainly in the Crusades, that there's very little, particularly when you're dealing with different groups of people together. It's very difficult to show people cause and effect. In an army, sometimes in an army, if you go around telling people that the punishment for looting is that you get hung, okay, you do it a few times, hopefully a few people get the idea. Even then, it's hard to do. But if you're in a country and there are people coming in and out the whole time, these mercenaries don't speak the same language, they don't know the local laws, they're not interested in the local laws, you know, whatever, they're just out of control. It's very difficult to stop people. And the other thing is, in Europe and in other more peaceful parts of the world, you find often there's the ability to levy fines. So you don't have to chop somebody's arm off. You can, you know, fine them 6 shillings or something. But in the Crusades, but in the Crusades, a lot of people don't have access to money. You can't fine them.
Right.
You can't exile them because they're
The infrastructure isn't there.
Yeah.
Right.
So punishment has to be very visible and very horrific.
Visceral.
And talking of visible, I think that's where our friendly camel comes in. Basically, it's a portable execution scene. You know, so you nail somebody up to this poor camel, and then I think you just sort of take it around town so that everybody gets a good look at what, you know, what Fred was up to and the consequences. I think you have to hope that there's a wooden frame on the camel.
Yeah.
Otherwise, yes, you know, the RSPCA would be up in arms like that. But I know, absolutely. But the visibility is the important thing there. I think. So you want it to be ghastly, you want it to be visible, and you want it to act as partly a deterrent, but it's also about power and authority. You know, these tend to be bigger criminals who are flouting the authorities, so they're made an example of. Whereas most people would either be run out of town or lose a hand.
But do you think like they got to a point where they'd seen so many camel parades and other horrific things where they just are so desensitized that it just
Absolutely.
they're like, okay.
Yeah.
And they just would do the crime anyway.
Yes. You're absolutely right. I mean, the trouble is there are so few alternatives. They don't have, if you think all of the Crusader states are, they're very low levels of productivity. So there's very, very low, you know, excess resources. There's no money for prisons. Even if you look at Egypt under Saladin. So Egypt's by far the richest country. They've got the Nile. They've got a, you know, proper economy with money and, you know, sophisticated things like that. We know from the early years of Saladin's reign in Egypt that over 95% of the state's budget went on the army. So that leaves you with 5%. And most of that 5% went on fortifications and the navy. You know, that, so you've got 1%, or a couple of percent that goes into what we would call maybe social benefits, but none of that's going to trickle down to ordinary people. So it really is, you have to make a show of it because you don't have prisons by and large.
No.
But they do have a few prisons in Cairo and other parts of Egypt. But in most of the Crusader states, you don't have any. The odd dungeon, maybe.
And I guess like for my final question, so there was a passage that sort of stuck out in my mind in the Brigands and Bandits chapter. About peasants near Nablus, where they mentioned, so there are a couple incidents where they're in the fields, or there was a father and his son and a friend, and then they see the Franks and they freeze, and the Franks pass them by, and they're like, wow, they didn't attack us, they didn't. So the surprise, the thing you said there that I thought was interesting was the surprise was that the violence didn't happen. Like, was it really so bad that when they wrote about it, they were like, we're writing about this because it didn't happen. Like so how bad?
Yeah, to me that's the fun thing about that I had writing the book was it's in looking at familiar things with a new eye, you come to quite different things. So actually, the village, the reference you're talking about there are village annals. So it's all the most interesting, important things that happened to that village, over a period of 50 odd years. So there's an editorial aspect to it. So what they're doing is all the big things that happen. And there's actually a Christian pilgrim account that's uncannily similar. It's outside Nablus as well, and there's pilgrims going through, and it's very tense. And exactly the same thing happened. So the pilgrims wrote how impressed they were and how shocking it was that they weren't attacked and murdered. They were expecting that. And we know there are two different accounts from the same village records where people were like cowering in ditches. They could see a whole load of Franks coming. They could hear the singing and the prayers, whatever. And the shock that merited it going into the village chronicles was that they hadn't all been murdered and raped and dragged off into slavery. So on the one level, you think, okay, well, those slightly crazy stories. But what they also say is the much bigger picture. This is the fabric of rural life. Where if you see a stranger, you're in trouble. If you leave the village, you could be dead. If you're not with a large group of people to protect you, you're in trouble. It's where violence and danger is the norm.
Like the guy who waited for the army until he moved.
Exactly. Yeah. There's Abbot Daniel, who's a Russian pilgrim who came through.
Yeah.
With his own small army, ironically, walking down the road, and he had to wait for 10 days for the entire field army of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem to come by, and then he tagged onto them so he could make the next step down the road. Walking down the road was such a dangerous thing. If you look at, interestingly, actually, this is one thing I did in the last book, looking at the Templar castle network. Some of the more interesting castles are along the roads, particularly the road from Jaffa to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem to the Jordan, and they're pretty much in sight of each other. These are not long roads. I mean, I think Jaffa to Jerusalem is, if you were walking freely and had water, maybe a day and a half, 10 and 3/4. You'd probably stay overnight. But there were Templar castles. I think they had 7 or 8, and they weren't the only ones with the castle. So along this route, if you couldn't see a castle, if you couldn't see a small army of people prepared to help you, you were in trouble. And this was not paranoia. This was learned behavior. People walking down that road saw dead bodies on either side and wrote about it. It's like something out of Mad Max. And that nobody buried the bodies, not because they weren't religious. I mean, quite the opposite. They're much more religious than us. But they can't bury the bodies because if you stop,
you're
you're just as dead as they are. Everybody just has to keep moving and hope for the best. Yeah, it's this level of violence and criminality that once you start looking for it, you realize it's so pervasive. So it's another reason why the chroniclers didn't really mention it that much. It comes out in small bits and pieces, but it was so much the fabric of their life. And they thought, well, everybody knows this. I don't need to say how dangerous it is to walk down the road because everyone knows that. So yeah, it's quite shocking, really.
And then I just wanted to say that this book is actually part of an unofficial trilogy, sort of now, that began with the Templars and then now Crusader Criminals. So what's the next part that you're working on?
Well, yeah, the next part is so this is sort of a bad boys trilogy. The next part would be, which I think is coming out
2025.
Yeah, coming out would be a Christmas book for next year, which is called Assassins and Templars: the Promise of Death, and it's looking at how these two strange, semi-cults developed their own branding through the promise of death, how they played off each other, things they strangely had in common, even though they were each their own nemesis. So I'm having great fun doing that because there hasn't been a lot, well, certainly very little written about how the two bounce off each other. But the assassins haven't had a proper look at for many decades. Yeah.
I'm going to open the floor to anybody who has questions.
I thought what really struck me is how you were talking about how you're applying better enough. How did you actually go about doing the research where you've gone, it's not just narrative history, it's actually you've got to file all of these examples from where did you find these things? How did you go about it?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. That's very good question. The bad news is that, well, it's good and bad news is they're everywhere in small pieces. Because Yale very kindly did a kind of Crusaders at War trilogy for me. I had to read everything and take notes on everything, and it was that process which led me to think that there were a lot of stories and a pattern of stories that hadn't been told. So So the downside is, if you were starting from scratch, it would be a hell of a lot of work. If you know the sources, it's much less work. The interesting thing is creating the patterns out of it afterwards. And I try to do that through different chapters. So there's a chapter on piracy and big chapter on murder and what are the things that create murders, why are there so many pirates, and it actually ties in with the more standard narrative histories as well. So for instance, one of the questions I've always been interested in is why didn't the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem or any of the Crusader states have a navy? You know, you could argue they're the one European set of states that actually need a navy more than anything else. Then their real name is Outremer. You know, they didn't call themselves the Crusader states. They're the lands beyond the sea. So they were desperate to keep the sea lanes open, but they didn't have a navy. So I started to look at pirates, and I think they provide a very plausible explanation about why you don't need a navy if you've got millions of psychos at your beck and call. Then they'll do the job for free. You know, so yeah. So thank you. Good question.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. I was wondering if I might be doing a bit of comparison. So the picture you paint is one of the standard rates of violence across the region. Is that quantitatively different from what's happening in Europe? I mean, is Utrecht different, or is this just the nature of violence?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. The word quantitative is a lovely one. It's very, very difficult. Yeah. I mean, even modern crime statistics, I wouldn't necessarily believe, and they're very controversial. There are no, obviously there are very few medieval crime statistics, and very, very few in the Middle East. But I think what is clear, I mean, there is some quantitative data in the book, as in things like the Nile and so on, and the rise and fall. I did quite a lot of comparative, and I have got some comparative examples between Europe and the Middle East, and I think it's probably fair to say that other societies suffer from many of the same problems. They don't have a lot of crime and punishment. They don't have the resources to do that. But it's pretty clear that the levels of random violence are much less. So I'm sure it was still dangerous walking from village to village in England, but it was something to look out for rather than something to 100% expect. Whereas if you go through and look at the patterns of behavior in the Middle East in the period of the Crusades, it is Mad Max territory. And it is partly because you have so many foreigners there, so many people who don't have a big stake in society, people who are effectively armed tourists. It's a tourist industry based on young, unstable men with weapons. So say if you take England as an example, there are periods of war, there are armed men around occasionally, and you find there are pub fights where everybody's got a knife, so that's going to escalate. But you don't get the same level of social instability and dislocation as, say, when you get an army of crusaders coming in or an army of steppe nomads coming in. At that point, all bets are off. You're really into ghastly, almost horror film kind of violence sometimes. But thank you for that. Very good question.
Questions? Go ahead.
Hi, Connor. How you doing?
Thank you very much. So much of the historiography of the Crusades focus on the social ideology have an impact. I'm wondering how you square that with some of the demographic.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I think, in some ways you can't argue with the logic of it. So say taking chivalry, on one level, you can't say it's a bad thing. I mean, clearly, if you can persuade men not to rape as much, that's a very, very good thing. But you have to see in the context of the anthropological tsunami that's coming into the region, it's a very weak rod to try and hold back this torrent of bad behavior and so on. So yeah, no, I was permanently disappointed with that. The other thing that was slightly shocking and disappointing was how, in a way, it's good. I think criminals were a lot less bigoted about religion than you might imagine. You know, you might think, oh, Christian criminals will attack Muslims, Muslim criminals will attack Christians, and there are going to be clear boundaries. And that's not the case at all. I mean, you just see it. You know, nobody is safe. It's all about opportunity, actually, and that's particularly something with pirates. I love talking about pirates. So, you know, they're basically just a man with a boat and an opportunity. You know, that's a pirate. And it's very much the same with I think with criminality literally on the ground. You find people again, you know, going back to those village chronicles from Nablus. There's one incident where a merchant is trying to move some goods from Nablus to Ascalon, which I think it was in Muslim hands at that point, but trade was still going on. So you think, well, that's kind of normal. So this guy's got a few wares. He's come from Damascus. He's got a bit of pottery, silver plate. Now, it's so dangerous that he has to hire guards. He has his own guards. He hires extra guards and guides in the village. You think, okay, well, that's a bit normal. Yeah, it's hugely costly to do that. You can see the enormous impact that it has on trade. I mean, it makes selling goods, moving goods, an absolute nightmare. But even once this poor guy has done all that, they haven't even left the village properly. They're on the outskirts of the village. And a couple of Frankish guys, and again, there aren't a lot of Franks around there, so God knows what they were doing. They were supposedly out looking for firewood, and they came in, they bound up the guards and stole everything. So these, and even the guys in the village didn't think they were criminals. They were just men out looking for firewood who spotted an opportunity, and it's like everything is up for grabs. You know, there's and that is a case where it's, you know, Christian on Muslim. But you look at, I can give you 100 examples going both ways where it's Muslim on Muslim, Christian on Christian. The boundaries are very, very thin. The key driver is you got a bunch of really dislocated people with very few moral boundaries, and certainly not that worried about, you know, what your theological beliefs are. If there's an opportunity, they're going to take it. Yeah, no, thank you.
Go ahead.
How does that match with you're fighting a holy war? And you have quick evidence.
Yes.
You go back to normal behavior.
Yeah, I just don't think people think it through, really. I mean, it is because you can find so much criminality on as you know, on every crusade. There's issues of discipline, and then when you arrive, half the guys are just turned to criminality. Sometimes they don't have much alternative. You know, they need food. They haven't got money to buy it. Somebody's got it. They steal it. So there's all of that. Again, it's a bit like chivalry. You know, there's a theoretical construct of moral boundaries, which in an ideal world, which is a good thing. I mean, clearly you want people to do good things. But when push comes to shove, people either don't have that opportunity, or they just don't care. They don't think it through. And there's a disconnect between the theory and the practice that runs through the whole of the region.
Any more? Yeah, Faith.
Yeah, I know you touched on this a little bit, but could you talk maybe a little bit more about the idea of prisons during the Crusades, medieval period? Because you talk about these deterrents. Was prison one of them? How did it work during the Crusades?
Great, thank you. It's probably worth saying the Crusaders themselves had very few prisons. You do just get the odd dungeon, a turret here and there. Because they had very economically primitive societies, they didn't have that luxury. But you do get really good prisons in Egypt, because they're rich, but also they've got a lot of mercenaries. So ironically, the Muslim prison system was very largely aimed at incarcerating Muslim soldiers, because particularly Mamluks were slaves. They didn't all want to be there, so there were quite big military prisons, which in the period of certainly later crusades were converted to hold prisoners of war. And so again, there's a whole chapter on that, because you do get this crazy thing where the prisoners suddenly become a micro society and carry out their own gangsterism.
A mafia.
Oh yeah, you basically get this kind of Christian, Frankish Crusader mafia dominating the vice trade of Cairo for a while. I don't know, the older people out there might remember Hogan's Heroes, basically about a prisoner of war camp, Second World War, and the kind of conceit is that the prisoners are actually so clever that they end up, running a little gangster thing out of their jails, and that's. I was shocked to see that literally is true in the Crusades. I'd like to think that the writers of Hogan's Heroes had come across that, but I suspect it was a coincidence. But you find that there are guys, Crusaders, who stay there for decades. They're used in the building sites, because Cairo is just one massive building site then, and they're big guys. They're used to hard work, and gradually they grow beards. They get their skin. So a lot of Crusaders were actually multi-ethnic anyway. Mixed race, Arab, Armenian, and so on. And so the guys actually become very, very difficult to tell as prisoners, because they're let out on the building sites. Sometimes, they usually come back. Sometimes they don't. They're increasingly looking like the locals. And you find the prison wardens are actually given instructions on forcing the guys to shave, because that's the only way they're going to tell the Franks from the Egyptians. And within a couple of generations, even that goes down. And you find that these Frankish prisoners of war dominate the illicit alcohol trade in Cairo, because they can, as Christians. They've got good links to the Coptic communities, and they're importing huge amounts of wine in. And then it's like The Godfather. Once you're into the prohibition and the wine, then you're into hookers, you're into drugs, and they controlled a lot of that. And then they married Coptic women, so you find even in the 15th century there are still references to Franks. They're no longer prisoners, and but they are just a kind of community, and they've developed like a little bit of Little Italy in New York. I mean, they've got their own territory, and they bribe officials much like the mafia. So you find that the Sultan protects them; they're under his protection, and I suspect it's not because he's Mother Teresa. I think it's because they're paying him lots of money to do it. No, thank you.
Go on. Yes. Thanks.
Alluded to the pluralistic and multi-ethnic.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And again, I think that plays very well against some of the tropes, certainly amongst the general public, about the Crusader states being quite, culturally quite difficult. In reality, I think a lot of it came down to the fact that the same reason that you can't afford to have a prison is you can't afford to have a really good justice system. So you find most of the local communities, as you know, had their own courts. If you're a Muslim, you would have a Muslim court. You'd give your oath on the Quran, and so on. So that, far from being overly prescriptive, I think the authorities were just very, very keen for it to go away as far as possible. And that's also reflected in the fact that there's very little police force. So you have the Viscounts of Viscomes have maybe a sergeant or two. But you, by and large, I think what primarily happens is that each community, every village and so on, has its own rais or headman or whatever who can look after things. And it's basically very delegated in a quite a not oppressive way. And that's not to say that the Crusaders wouldn't have liked to be more oppressive. I just don't think they could afford it. It's a kind of luxury that they didn't have,
They were also corrupt too. The police that they had.
Well, that's true.
Quite corrupt.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good point, Sandra. Because medieval bureaucracies are so corrupt, you do find that even when you do have a police force, this is true in Muslim societies as well as on the Crusader side, where you do have a police force, they're often more problematic than the crooks, because they've got a bit of power to do it. And there's that famous scene in Joinville where three police, literally police sergeants in Paris, go mug somebody and steal everything apart from his chemise. And this guy's a trainee priest. He's a clerk. And instead of just caving in, he goes back to his lodgings, picks up a crossbow and a falchion, which is like a huge drug dealer's machete, and runs after them down the road, kills one with the crossbow bolt. The other two go through somebody's garden. He smashes his way through the hedge. One of them's wearing one of the police sergeants has a very hefty leather boot on, and the priest manages to almost chop his leg off. His leg is only being held on by the boot. And all three, and he catches up with the last one, kills all three. And Louis forgives him. He realizes he doesn't really have a good career in the church anymore. That's kind of that fleeting opportunity has gone. But he's obviously a good man in a tough spot. So he comes on crusade. So you get this guy changes. It's a career-changing moment for him, which is wonderful. But yeah, and you find the same in Egypt. Say, if you look at the records there, the levels of corruption and the chiefs of police twisting things is extraordinary. Aleppo was particularly famous. You just find one police chief after another. They basically become almost they're one of the big players, and they are just basically the gangsters. They often run the brigands outside of town, and they take a cut of the profits. And it's great fun, unless you're on the receiving end of it. Alessandro.
Yeah, go on.
First of all, the story about the mafia.
I know, it's not true. It's not true.
Of course, you reference the reaction of the critical events, such as the fall of Jerusalem or others, in terms of these guys making contacts, making pacts, alliance, so they're actually protecting the
That's an interesting point. There's one particular. I think the sad answer is I'm sure it was happening, but they weren't writing the Chronicles. So, but there's one fabulous one. There's a Muslim emir, again called Usama, but not our friend Usama. The other is another Usama who became a pirate. So in the 1190s, there was a lot of Saladin dies, the Ayyubids split. And there's a lot of factionalism between Christians and Muslims there, a lot of fighting. It's all quite chaotic. And he takes advantage. So he's basically a massive crook. And he manages to take control of Beirut and doesn't just turn it into a fief. So he doesn't just want to be Lord of Beirut. He makes it a kind of pirate den. And he's the pirate Lord of Beirut. And that's fine. You'd think, okay, up to a point that works. But he is so uncontrollable that the Muslim authorities don't like him either. Whenever they're trying to create a truce or broker a diplomatic arrangement, this guy has no boundaries. So he will just go off and break it because there's a nice opportunity. There's a ship, it's got slaves, it's got whatever, got gold, he'll just do it. So eventually you find the Muslim authorities, I think this was 1197 in October, early October, sent an army out to say, enough is enough. We can't have you freelancing like this on the frontiers, and you've got to control your pirates. And so they went into Beirut, started dismantling the walls, and then extraordinarily they stopped. And Usama came to an arrangement with them, the guy in charge of the army, and he said it was fine. Don't worry, I'll defend Beirut on your behalf. And again, I think what you're seeing here is huge bribe taking place. It's not, basically he just gave the local commander a huge amount of money to go away. And within 10 days, the Franks came in and took the whole place over. He was basically just gambling the whole time, playing one off against the other. Oh, very much so. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the kind of characters they are. Not nice characters, but extraordinary characters. Yeah, and there was one very brave English pirate out there who arguably saved the entire crusading movement, which is, yeah, Godric of Finchale, if you believe that part of the story, who saved King Baldwin and saved the Crusader states, or certainly saved the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem when it looked like it was all up. But yeah, that's a whole chat. It's quite a big story.
For the next book. Is any more question? Yeah, one more question. Anybody have a question? Anyone? You're good? Okay. There is wine, and Steve will be happy to sign books in the foyer next door when we're having our wine reception. And we'd love to thank everybody for coming, and thank you to Yale for putting this
For being
wonderful,
wonderful.
for being putting this on.